Aakash, thank you for coming on the Illuminating Teams podcast. It's great to have you with me today.
Yeah, it's great to be here.
So I wanted to start off the chat today just with a little bit of background on you, a little bit of personal and professional background. So can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
100%. Yeah. And so my name's Aakash. I've been working in the marketing space for the last 8-9 years. I'm originally based in Sydney. I've been born and raised over here, lived here my whole life. Did a bit of travel about a few years ago. I spent about a year of my time living in India in about 2017 for some work, and also a bit of a personal trip. Like my background's Indian, so got to kind of spend a bit of time over there, working over there, kind of being in the culture over there. And then after that, then spend a few years in London as well. So I was there working there for about 3 or 4 years. And recently I've just shifted back over the last 10 months back to Sydney. And at the moment running Sorry on Mute and Growth Ganik, which are two of my main companies that I'm currently on. Sorry on Mute, as we'll talk about a bit, and Growth Ganik, which is currently a digital marketing company, and we focus on SEO consulting, on digital marketing strategy. My previous kind of background history started off about 9-10 years ago. I was a marketing intern essentially in my family business, which is a software company. And it was actually from there that I've really developed a lot of my skills in digital marketing, in SEO marketing and everything. And and from there, it's just been a pretty wild journey. And I've ended up being the head of marketing for a startup, and then moved to London and went into a hospitality company over there. And worked at a hospitality company in a digital marketing role. Ended up becoming redundant during COVID. During COVID, I think all the hospitality businesses and restaurants kind of went under, had a bit of that, it was a bit of a volatile time. And after that period, then I kind of decided I was kind of looking for work, and wasn't really into it, wasn't really excited about any of like kind of the roles I was finding. And decided at that point that I was going to kind of go on my own and start my own business, which was always a bit of a lifelong dream of mine. Not maybe the best circumstances, but it kind of ended up happening, and it's kind of worked out now. So, and was kind of where the birth of Sorry I Was in Mute and Growth Ganik came from. So, a bit about myself.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. I think it's not unusual to hear of people, in what were bad circumstances, then creating something new and making something fresh out of it. So it's really impressive that you're able to, I guess, just pick yourself up pretty quickly during the pandemic after being laid off and get started with something new. It's use it as an opportunity to build something else. So yeah, and that's, I think, when I came across you was when you were just starting out. You were still in London, and you had just started this blog, Sorry on Mute. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? I mean, why you decided to start that, and had you already started that while you were still working in the hospitality role, or did you start that after you became redundant?
Yeah, no, so that was right after when I became redundant. I had when I was kind of in that period of finding new roles, and I decided to kind of go on my own. I think one of the first things, and to be honest, actually, Sorry on Mute didn't really start as like a business opportunity or as like a kind of a startup in any sense. It was more, I guess, at that time, this is like March, April 2020, there was so much kind of, I guess, I wouldn't say chaos, but just so much confusion and so much just kind of like a lot of new scenarios for a lot of working people at that time. And the first one primarily being everyone just working virtually and working remotely. It was one area that kind of resonated with me a lot, because a lot of my working history before that had been through remote work, especially my time in Bangalore. And after that, my entire team would usually be actually remote, and they'll be based in either in Bangalore, other parts of India, and then even in other parts of the UK as well. So having kind of like a virtual setup or working with a remote team kind of was, I guess, wasn't as foreign to me at that point. And I saw it as an opportunity to kind of release some blogs and some thought pieces, I guess, about remote work, how to manage a remote team. I think at that point, and even now, there's a lot of content and a lot of people that do, I guess, digital nomading or working remotely for themselves. But the opposite, I guess, the other perspective of that in terms of how to manage your remote staff, how to work in a wider remote team in an established company. I think there was not a lot of content on that and not a lot of resources on that. Hence why it kind of started as that, and kind of focused on building content on that side. And it was really kind of, I guess, not a huge surprise, but it was nice to kind of see that a lot of people resonated with it. And I think that's how we connected, and connected with a number of people who were going through very similar journeys at that time. And essentially that was kind of like the birth of Sorry on Mute, and it's kind of built into what it is now.
The timing was fantastic. It was certainly needed at that time, and continues to be, obviously, as the trend has continued. And yeah, I was wondering, sort of, a little bit wondering about sort of what you've learned, I suppose, while building the blog. And that can be, I suppose, things you've learned about maybe building a business, or I mean, it wasn't I guess started out as a business, more as a blog, but things you've learned, but also things I suppose you would have actually been learning about remote work management through doing the research to write the blog articles. And so I was just wondering if you could share some insights on things you've learnt while building the blog.
Yeah, 100%. I guess it's kind of like the type of some of the main learnings have been from, I guess, the various different kind of topics that people really resonate with. Like some of the classic ones that I knew that people would resonate with would be on how to improve remote work communication, how to make sure, to increase or improve remote work productivity. Some of the classic kind of, I guess, challenges that people would directly see. But I think more of the, I guess, the more niche kind of areas were where I kind of had probably had the most learning. So things like on building remote work culture, which is kind of, I guess, more of like a medium to long term type of goal when you have, when you're managing when you're managing your teams. Also things like virtual games, virtual games in terms of how to have virtual team games based on certain events, or how to make sure that you have your right kind of Friday work kind of event as well. So it kind of, I guess, the diversity of what remote work looked like was probably the biggest, biggest surprise, in the sense that it's not just as simple as how do you make sure that your team's working well. There's a lot of different angles to it. And it also means, how do you improve remote work culture? How do you ensure that people are happy? How do you ensure that people are staying motivated? There's a lot of different kind of angles from there. In terms of for my team itself, I guess that was probably the biggest learning, in the sense that I had focused in the past and before COVID. A lot of it was just about kind of wanting to make sure that we hit our goals, and we want to hit all the, the work, all our goals, make sure that we achieve our projects, make sure that we're catering to clients well. But in terms of actually building a culture, making sure that our team's working well, that we're all, mentally healthy, those are the elements that I guess I hadn't focused on as much as I thought I should have. And that type of content coming out from other places, as well as people resonating with kind of similar content that I was putting out there, that was probably one of the biggest gaps, where I was like, you know what, this is an area that really needs to be focused on. And I think it still is right now.
Yeah, for sure. I think going back to what you said, I guess in that initial stage, I think the initial part of remote work, a lot of people thought of remote work as it tended to be more like you said, digital nomads and freelancers who perhaps could be plugged into a team. And so it was, and that sort of style compared to being the core team, all remote or distributed. And so it was quite a shift in terms of what you would expect typically in person from a culture in a team, and then to try and build that virtually brought a whole bunch of interesting new challenges. So did you then, as you were sort of learning, did you then about these sort of, as you said, niche, or other sort of areas, did you then try and implement those in your own team? And where was your team based? Were you in multiple locations and time zones and things, or?
I guess with my team, it was all primarily, they're all based in India, and I was in the UK at the time, and now in Australia. So it was, I guess, easier in the sense of it was just kind of one time zone to deal with in terms of the Indian time zone. But all the team members internally there were all working remotely too. So no one was physically kind of working together or in the same place. But I guess, sorry, yeah, to your earlier question in terms of implementing it, yeah, 100%. And I think it's interesting. I think with your I remember when we first met, we did the 100-point challenge game, and the facilitated game from there. And actually that ended up having a really kind of positive response amongst our team. And we then kind of, I guess, focused on having more facilitated type of events. I guess internally we would have like kind of more, the classic virtual Friday night stand, Friday drinks, or like, trivias and stuff. But what we were finding actually was that type of, I guess, interaction sometimes felt a little forced, sometimes felt a little almost jarring, and I guess there'd be a little repetitive. So kind of having like the facilitated games from companies like yours, or having like a third person essentially kind of take care of the situation, kind of ended up making it flow a lot better, put off the pressure from all the other team members that they need to kind of, I guess, keep things running and, make sure everything works well. So yeah, definitely implemented it. Now we at the moment we have we run on a policy of at least every 6 weeks that we need to have a facilitated game happening. And that's usually organized by one of the team members, where they kind of find someone that they like and then they kind of facilitate it. And yeah, it goes from there.
That's great. Yeah. No, it's really important to have that, to have something to do that's informal, sort of, whether it's an activity. Often activities are easier to get people
100%.
around, can be less awkward, but to help build those relationships. And so it's not all just work and sort of asking each other for various work tasks. So I think that's that's fantastic that you're doing that with your team. I was wondering, seeing you're very in this space as well, if you obviously, like, the landscape has changed a lot, and we've moved sort of into now much more hybrid, and lots of people, I guess, are going back to the office. A lot of companies are trying to get people back into the office more and more, but there's still a large number of companies who are working remote and distributed. Are there any new trends, recent trends, other trends that you've seen in this space?
Yeah, trends wise, I think it is an ever evolving space. I think at the moment it's currently at that stage of, I'd say, like kind of that post pandemic kind of stage where things aren't like, I guess when it first started off in, in the 2020 period, or most of 2020, remote work or everyone working remotely was definitely more of kind of, at least in those initial 6 to 9 months, seen as like a stopgap arrangement of everyone's working remotely at the moment. And then after that, we'll kind of see if things go back to normal and what normal kind of looks like. I guess we're at that normal at the moment where remote work or a hybrid work policy is now starting to be a bit more ingrained into actual, to company work policies now. And I guess that's currently the stage that we're at the moment, like where what does that policy look like? How does that kind of spell out for different kind of industries? And you can kind of see a lot of different trends kind of ranging from various industries. I guess, like legal and consulting are kind of in a real battle at the moment, where, they're traditionally like very face-to-face type of companies where they need to have their staff on the ground, whether it's in a client site or whatever. But now, with over the last couple of years, now they're kind of at a stage where they're like, do we really need to be doing that? I think hybrid could probably work, maybe even an entire remote work policy could work. So it's currently at that stage where I guess it's being ingrained into remote work policies for different companies. And what that kind of looks like is where we're kind of like, I guess, getting towards. So kind of making it a bit more of a permanent fixture. If you kind of apply for a job now as well, one of the perks is, it's hybrid, or it's a remote work kind of position only. Hybrid being probably the more prominent one, and that's kind of, I guess, starting to become quite standardized. That's kind of like an expectation almost for a lot of jobs. So I guess we're at that stage where I'd say now up until for another year or so, that's going to be like, it's going to be more ingrained. It's going to be a bit more concrete. A bit more later down the line, some of the trends that you're now starting to see is definitely things like, a lot of people are talking about having like virtual video conferencing type of tools set up, or like, artificial intelligence in remote work and remote teams. Artificial intelligence, I think, is something that kind of seeps into every single type of new industry anyway. But for them to eventuate and become like a proper trend and become a bit more mainstream, I think is a little more later down the line. But at the moment, it's more the permanence of remote work, the permanence of hybrid work is where we're at right now.
Yeah, for sure. No, that's I've seen some interesting articles. I think it's so the sector that you work in is very important in terms of the attitude towards remote and hybrid work. I think banking is the least receptive
Least
to,
receptive,
yeah,
100%.
to remote work. And then at the other end of the spectrum, obviously you have technology companies, and which it's obviously much easier with many jobs, especially engineering, I think, to work in remote teams. So I think certainly some industries lend themselves more to remote and distributed work than others, but you have a lot of, as you said, with the consultancy legal firms, some pushback, I think, from more traditional
Yeah,
industries as well. Um,
completely.
and then I just wanted to ask about, I mean, obviously you've managed a remote team, a distributed team, yourself, and you've obviously, read all about all the different aspects from writing Sorry on Mute. What do you think are the main, and I suppose you've talked about a couple of the main challenges, but the main challenges for people leading remote teams?
Yeah, look, I mean, one of them, as I mentioned, is remote work culture. I'll get to that one, I think, maybe a little later on. But I think the core, I'd say the core element and the core main one is definitely communication. How you're communicating with your team, how often you're communicating with them, what style of communication, what platform you're communicating with them on. I think just is probably the biggest challenge, especially when you have like a brand new team and they're all working remotely. That's probably the one that I've had to kind of test out a lot over time in terms of what the best way to communicate is. And I think that's improved over the years as well with the new kind of software tools that have come in, and the main platforms. But I guess I'd say remote, like, communication would be the main one. And I guess we'll talk a bit about in terms of how to kind of overcome that and what we've kind of done to overcome that. And then from that, then kind of seeps into just the wider culture part of things as well. I'm fairly notorious with, and then I guess a lot of people might be, but I'm definitely very notorious with whenever I do communicate with my team, and especially when it's over Slack or when it's over Zoom, to kind of really not talk about like a lot of like kind of the more things of like, how's your day going, or like how was your weekend, or probably the more surrounding conversation that naturally happens when you are in person with each other. And that type of stuff is where I guess a lot of company culture lies, right? Culture does lie in terms of how your team kind of interact with each other, what type of respect's there, and if it only kind of boils down to only kind of, I guess, delivering tasks, delivering project, and like kind of only talking about work, which is important, don't get me wrong, and that's obviously the crucial part of it. That can sometimes really erode on people's productivity, on their their motivation to kind of stay at work. And I've definitely experienced that with some of my team members, and I've needed to make sure that we do integrate that in, and we do make sure that we have time to have some non-work related conversations as well. I think another one is definitely, and especially with some of the more junior members that come in, is providing kind of mentorship for them as well. In a remote setup, especially when you have, let's say, a grad or an intern, or someone who's junior, or someone who's a kind of, I guess, learning a certain part of the job that they need to kind of learn through their manager, or through someone like myself or one of the mentors there. You have to be very intentional about providing them that type of I guess those skills, or that type of experience. Again, when you're in person, you absorb a lot of what's going on around you when you see your team members around you in terms of the meetings, the work that's happening. When you're kind of, I guess, when you're working remotely, you're siloed off almost. And it can be, it can happen where your more junior members can be forgotten, or like, they can fall through the cracks, and you're not too sure of like, are you actually teaching them what they need to learn? So yeah, and I guess all of these kind of are very interrelated to each other. A lot of it is about like kind of making sure that you're communicating well, you're making sure that you have non-work related conversations as well with each other, as well as like, you're able to kind of provide mentorship for your junior people. So yeah, those would be probably the core ones.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really good one. The third one there as well. Something
Yeah.
I've certainly experienced as well in terms of training and development for new team members. Often, I guess in the past, you would have sat next to each other, maybe showed them a few things, when needed on your screen, or had a meeting in that way. But now, It's about finding ways in which to do that, using
Completely.
tools. And it depends if you can be synchronous in terms of time zones as well, in terms of, because then you can obviously hop on, you can share screens and you can show them things. But I think the challenge is even greater when you're working in different time zones and it has to be sort of asynchronous, or alternatively someone has to get up at really early or stay up really late in order to be synchronous. So there's additional challenges there around personal and private life in terms of
Completely.
work-life balance.
Yeah. And even I guess, just to kind of add to that, it's also even like, I guess the activity of, for the last point of training development, even the activity of like for, the mentee to kind of ask questions. When you are there in person, you're not going to be, I guess it kind of works in a very fluid motion where you don't know something, you'd be like, hey, can you help me out with this? Hey, could you help me out with that? When you are doing it, virtually, typing that out constantly, that it can be a little intimidating for someone like someone who is learning, because they'll think, oh, maybe I'm like pestering them too much. They might see their chat history where they've asked a number of questions, or they might be a little discouraged from, hey, maybe I shouldn't be asking these many questions already. So it's even like really kind of specific things like that that end up, I guess, hindering that entire kind of process of really building someone up. And I think it probably even ranges to just onboarding in general. Like, I mean, it doesn't have to necessarily just be for providing mentorship, but onboarding in general, where those initial months where you're learning on the job, you want to make sure that you have like the right kind of setup where they're learning very quickly in a virtual environment, even though they're individually there by themselves, but they have the ability to kind of learn as quickly as possible and build from there.
Yeah, for sure. You covered a few different challenges, and I think what you said about communication is that's kind of the basis, I suppose, of a lot of these different challenges. But are there any sort of particular processes or tools that you've implemented or that you found really helpful in addressing some of those challenges? So communication, for example, if we start with that, how have you gone about trying to address that challenge with remote work?
Completely. Look, I think this is like, the boring answer is process. Like, I feel like having like a really set, defined process with your team, kind of would resolve like a lot of all of the 3 or 4 things that I mentioned. For communication, a lot of it is just dependent on, like, I think the first one we need to figure out is determining of like, when to kind of communicate, or essentially when you're having your set periods of communication. So things like your daily stand-ups, I've made sure that those are absolutely regular, where every single morning we have to have at least 10 to 30 minutes of interacting about whatever's going on. And then also then determining, I guess, so stand-ups like probably the most clear. Then you have your various different meetings that might not happen on a daily basis, but you want to make sure you have regular kind of checkups. We also have like kind of a checkout every Friday as well, where we kind of go through everything that needs to be, what we've completed, what needs to be done, what's going to flow over to the week after, or, from there, like, so there's like a lot of different type of elements there. And then your second layer of communication that we focus on is then your more kind of, I guess, ad hoc meetings. So things like if something's not working, or if there's an answer needed immediately for something, we then make sure to kind of limit that a bit more towards just chat. And we're just talking through Microsoft Teams or Slack for there. And it's not like that we're constantly jumping on calls and, really tiring everyone out through that. And calls then just kind of become the only, I guess, only when it's really required do we really jump on a call. And usually that doesn't happen too much, but, now and again, when there's like an urgent task that needs to be done, we'll immediately jump onto that and kind of go from there. I guess the other element of that is defining what our communication platforms are as well. Before, like, when I was, managing the teams early, like about 4 or 5 years ago, it used to be Skype and email used to be the 2 things. And I can't even understand how we used to use Skype and email, at that point. Right now, it's just become a lot more easier and a lot more sophisticated. We currently use Microsoft Teams. Teams is the main one at the moment, where most of the chat and, the file sharing and the communication happens. And we have calls, I guess, within Microsoft Teams as well. But then asynchronous communication like Loom has become like a key element of our function in the team as well. So especially for the more task-based things that need to pass through or the ad hoc work that kind of comes through, I make sure to just make a loom, send it through, and then they get it done when they need to, as opposed to gathering everyone every second day for like a quick call to go through something. And that's kind of eliminated a lot of like the I guess the unnecessary elements of communication there. I guess the other element is we're very intentional about how often we do meetings. Meetings, I guess, are obviously important, but I think have a lot of dead weight to functioning a team if not done properly. Most of our team, most of our meetings, we want to wrap up within 30 to 45 minutes, not even go into the hour mark, because I think within an hour, people get pretty tired of it, of things and stuff. But with Loom, through communicating through just Microsoft Teams and chat, and then, the occasional stand-up calls and stuff, most of that kind of becomes streamlined quite nicely. And, things start functioning quite well there.
Yeah, for sure. We use Loom as well. It's a really great tool. Fantastic. And I just wanted to touch on another topic, a slight sort of change of topic, but that's team performance. I think sort of the productivity of teams, I think that's something that's obviously really important to any team leader or manager, is the productivity of the team. And I think I've read sort of some varying literature on whether or not remote work leads to more productivity or less productivity. I think the research is still being done on that. But in your experience, what have you found as sort of the most important factors or levers of team performance in your team within a remote environment? And do you think the levers for team performance are any different actually between in a remote team versus an in-person team?
So I think the levers are the same, but it's which ones that you focus on more is what varies between remote and in person. So some of like the key lever, like, some of the key things that I think of to make sure team performance is on point is like, I guess a lot of the standard stuff. So things like, making sure that we're working towards the same goal and we know what we're working towards. So the team knows what we're trying to achieve, whether it's a client project, whether it's like an internal, just in growing the company itself, whether it's, building more clients, whatever that is. Really making it clear why we're doing the piece of work that we're doing is probably first and foremost. It actually eliminates a lot of various, potential confusion, potential, I guess, I guess that's probably the clear one where we all know what the North Star is. And I think that's relevant whether you're in person or a remote. For a remote one, for that one, I guess, is needing to make sure that that's just really drilled down, because you have to, or like, and that needs to be just kind of like very clear through, maybe it's an internal, post-it note that you have within the team that everyone kind of sees clearly what's there. Or maybe it's like a document that everyone kind of knows what the rough goal is there too as well. The other ones, I guess, is also things like, I guess, clarity in roles and responsibilities. Making sure that we know, or each team member knows what they're working on and what they're kind of doing. I mean, I run a marketing team, so sometimes there's a lot of overlap in people's, I guess, activities that they need to be achieving. So things like, we have people who are in our content team that are building content, but as well as people in our design team that help with the graphics and building websites as well. Sometimes there's a bit of overlap between the two in terms of like, and not so much overlap in terms of like the implementation and the actual work of it, but in terms of the creative side of it, like, where there's a creative, like, who's actually leading the creative vision behind whatever we're trying to achieve. So sometimes there's a bit of overlap in that. So making sure there's really kind of clear roles defined from there, which again, I think are relevant for both if you're in person or remote as well. I guess to my previous answer, process. Like, I think that's kind of making sure that we have process for how we communicate, process for how, we deliver a project, process for, how we review or analyze the client's kind of industry or whatever that work is, making sure that we're kind of following a set, number of steps, so we're not, I guess, wasting too much time in doing other work that, that can be eliminated through just having a very clear and easy process. So all of those ones, I think, are like, I guess it's relevant to a team in general. I think just the only difference is, for a remote team, you just need to be more intentional about doing all of those things. and making sure it's all very clear and it's drilled down with all your team members. Sometimes, again, like, as I was mentioning before, you can have team members who are kind of falling through the cracks in the sense of like, you're not sure if they're on board with understanding what needs to be achieved, if they know about what I guess the clear, what their responsibility is or how they kind of fit in the wider team and stuff. So ensuring that clarity is there is probably the added element of when you're working remotely, because you want to make sure that's like, completely clear with your team. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. And is there anything in particular that you've implemented around accountability in your remote team?
Yeah, for sure. Look, definitely nothing like, I guess, out of the ordinary. I think it's the standard, like, making sure that you're like, I guess, that process part of having your stand-ups, making sure that you know what everyone's working on and what they're working towards. I think regular check-ins as well, like, just non-work related check-ins I've started having, especially with my more senior team members, and I encourage them to do that with their junior team members as well. Those are probably the key parts, I guess. What I usually do for accountability parts, and maybe it's just the nature of work that I'm on, is at the beginning of each week, I mean, there's essentially 2 layers to it. The beginning of each month, we always have, I guess, clear definitions of what we need to be achieving for the month. And that's a variety of different kind of objectives, whether it's for client-based ones in terms of achieving like a client-based content piece or website or whatever we're working towards there. Or if it's like internal based things as well, whether it's, building new web pages for our own website or building new leads or getting new leads for our site as well. Ensuring that we have like very clear, objectives for each month is the first step. And then kind of breaking that down in weeks. So usually every week, then we have a few different things that we need to be achieving based on those various different objectives. And that kind of helps out a lot because it holds a lot of accountability for if something hasn't, been done, or we haven't hit that goal or objective for whatever reason, then you can directly just, have that conversation if you need to, in terms of where was the stumble, where do we need to kind of fix it? Maybe we need to like work towards this, or maybe we need to replan that.
Yeah, fantastic. Thanks so much. It's been really, it's been really insightful, and you've given us so many tips, I think, that we can take forward for those of us who are leading remote and distributed teams. Just wanted to ask one final question, and that's that I ask to everyone who comes on, about if there's a particular resource you could recommend, whether that be a book. I normally say blog. Obviously, everyone should check out Sorry on Mute, but any other blog or podcast or that you think has helped you in leading a remote and distributed team?
Yeah, 100%. I would definitely recommend some of the all remote companies that are out there. So like, GitLab, Zapier, they're like they're 100% distributed companies, and they were that before COVID as well. They have like a lot of good resources on their respective sites of what their remote work policies are, how they've managed to grow, because I think each of them are billion-dollar companies now as well. So it's fairly impressive in terms of how they managed to grow completely distributed. So they have like a lot of valuable resources, and they do like a lot of research as well. So a lot of statistical stuff in terms of, remote work preferences, how to, how people are feeling in different kind of, I guess, parts of the world for remote work. And you get like a lot of interesting stats from there too. But I definitely recommend they're a great starting point, because they aren't just kind of preaching remote work. They're at the same time they're implementing it, and they have that set up as well. So everything that they're writing there is tried and tested, and really good stuff. So yeah, definitely check some of the GitLab, Zapier, Remote How, some of their blogs there.
Good one. Fantastic. Yes, I've definitely looked through GitLab's documentation before. They're fantastic. So
yeah, they're really good.
Good tip. All right. Thank you so much, Aakash, for coming on. And really appreciate your time.
Cheers, mate. Thanks, Dan. I'll catch you. See ya.